She was an alien girl on the run, and the human was her only hope. He liked this time of night when machines slowed and the air felt less crowded. The planet's wind moved quietly, carrying smells he still could not name. He had come here to think, to be alone with the slow hum of the world. He saw the movement before he heard it. A ripple of color near the scrub, a flutter that did not belong to any bird or insect he knew. Ethan paused. He had been a scientist for many years, and curiosity had pulled him into more trouble than fear ever had. He stepped off the cleared path and moved toward the color. She looked nothing like the colony's people. She was small, not much taller than a child, but she moved with a steady, careful grace. Her skin caught the dim light and shimmered in soft blues and greens, like a fish at the bottom of a quiet sea. Her eyes were large and black, and when she looked at him they were full of a deep alertness. She lifted one hand slowly, palm out, as if to show she had no weapon. Ethan's heart beat a little faster. He knew rules. He knew the protocols for encountering unknown life. He also knew the feeling of meeting someone who needed help. The rules could be followed later. He crouched down and kept his voice low and soft. "Hey," he said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She did not answer with words. Instead, she made a sound like a small bell, high and clear. Ethan watched her carefully. Her breathing was fast, but she did not run. Around them, the night was wide and calm, the colony lights distant and safe. Ethan reached slowly into his jacket and took out the small device he always carried. It was a pocket translator, the kind used to learn local dialects on other worlds. It was crude and slow, but it had helped him in exchange markets and with old data logs. He set it between them and switched it on. The screen lit up, a small green pulse. "Can you understand this?" he asked. He did not know which language to use. He tried his own, then a common trade tongue, then a softer, older human dialect. The device answered with a small chirp and showed no match. Ethan sighed. He had hoped for faster work. The alien girl watched the device with interest. She reached out and touched it lightly. The translator flickered. Then a thin thread of light slid from the device to her fingertip and then back again. The girl's face changed. She pressed her forehead to the translator for a moment, as if listening to something inside it. Then she made another bell sound. It had more words now, small and careful. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He remembered to breathe and to wait. The girl lifted her hand again, this time moving her fingers in a slow pattern, like the movements of a person tracing letters in the air. Her sounds came again, layered like songs. The translator's light brightened. It began to show rough symbols, then a single word in a language Ethan had read about but never heard in life. "Lyra." He smiled despite the strangeness. "Lyra," he said, "my name is Ethan." She repeated his name with the same gentle curiosity. Then she looked toward the colony and tightened her lips. The bell sound returned, louder and sharper. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. He could see the faint shapes of security drones above the main street, their lights sweeping. He wondered how long they had been searching. Lyra stood up slowly. She moved away from the translator and joined Ethan at his level. She reached out and laid a small, cool hand on his wrist. The touch was startlingly human. Her skin felt like wet clay warmed by sun, not cold or alien at all. She did not pull away when he sank his fingers around hers. Instead, she looked into his face with an intensity that said she was counting on him in a way she could not yet say. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan said softly. He did not know why he said it. Perhaps because part of him wanted to protect the colony. Perhaps because he feared the unknown. Lyra tilted her head and then made a softer sound, one that the translator offered as a single line. "Run." "Run from what?" Ethan asked. She closed her eyes and made a movement with her hands that the translator translated as hunters. That word made a chill run through Ethan. Hunters meant others. Hunters meant pursuit. He thought of the stories the older colonists told at the mess hall, stories of corporations that stole biota, of war parties that hunted for strange things. He thought of the rules against bringing unknown species inside the colony gates, but rules were meant to keep people safe. They also could keep people from seeing what mattered. He looked at Lyra and sensed with more than thought that she was not a threat. She was frightened and clever and alone. Ethan stood. He made a quick decision. "Come with me," he said, "to my place. We can work out the rest there." Lyra hesitated for a single heartbeat. The bell sound from her throat changed again, a mixture of relief and worry. She took his hand and followed him. They moved fast but quiet, slipping past the last fences and into the ruination that had once been farmland. Ethan's flat had been a research nook for years. He had tools and maps and broken instruments stacked like the bones of old machines. He kept the door unlocked for fresh air and sometimes for stray animals. He closed it softly behind them and sat Lyra on an old crate. He offered her water. She accepted it with gladness, making the bell sound that the translator gave as cold. She drank with the same careful grace, and Ethan watched her like someone watching a new experiment. He set the translator beside her and tried a new code. He fed it patterns from the recordings he had compiled of local species calls. The device began to pick up echoes in Lyra's voice and match them to small images. The translation was messy at first, 2 or 3 words at a time, but it grew. "What happened?" Ethan asked a half-hour later. Lyra lay back on a tangle of blankets and looked at the roof as if it were the sky. Her hands fluttered and the translator gave him words in a slow sequence. "Escape, sky took, many lost, family gone." Ethan felt the weight of those words. He had seen loss in many forms here: failed crops, broken trade, a child who left the colony and never returned. But the way the translator arranged Lyra's language made the loss feel deeper and more precise, like missing notes in a song. "Hunters wanted you," he asked. Again the same word, hunters. Lyra added more images now: metal ships, black nets, silver eyes that watched from above. She tapped the translator to show a symbol that matched tracking. Her small finger traced a line across the device and then pulled back quickly, showing the motion of being taken and then breaking free. Ethan thought of the drones he had seen above the street. He thought of the way the colony's scanners swept for unregistered life forms. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he reached for a worn map and spread it across the table, setting a small beam of light onto its surface. He pointed to the sketches he had made of a nearby ravine, a low place where the wind made strange music and the ground kept secrets. "We can't keep you here forever," he said. "If they are looking, they might come to the colony. You could be safer somewhere else." Lyra's face changed with emotion Ethan could not name. She made a slow, single-word sound that the translator gave as friend. Then she reached up and pressed her forehead to his. The contact felt oddly intimate, like a promise. Ethan did not pull away. He let her rest there for a long moment, feeling the echo of a life that had been carried across a universe into his small, dusty flat. He started to work. He had a small cache of spare parts he had kept from campus projects: old sensors, a field coil, a filament from a broken scanner. He took them out and began to assemble a device. He explained aloud, more to keep the silence away than for Lyra's sake. He told her how it would help translate better and perhaps mask her energy signature. Her eyes followed his hands. She watched the way he moved metal and wire and small chips into place. Her breath came easier, as if seeing someone do practical, human work gave her calm. "Will this hide you?" she asked finally. "It might," Ethan said, and he did not promise more than he thought true. "It will make you harder to find from above. It will also let us talk." Lyra nodded. She pressed her palm to the half-built device, and the small glow of her skin turned the metal warm. Ethan felt the hairs on his forearm rise. The coil in his hand buzzed faintly, then settled as if content. As the night deepened, the colony outside slipped into the steady rhythm of machines and the quiet of sleeping people. Ethan worked with the slow perfection of someone who had always preferred solving puzzles. He wove together the parts and added a small ring of glass he had found at the market. When he turned the device on, it hummed like a tiny planet of its own. The translator's screen filled with new signals, and for the first time Lyra's voice came out in longer phrases. "My home," the device printed. "Sky City. Hunters came at dawn. I ran to ground. I hid in wind grasses. I found place where light did not touch." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He had imagined many possible origins for this girl, but a Sky City had not been on the list. He asked, "Can you go back? Is your family there?" Her reply was quick and raw. "Gone, only me." He felt his throat tighten. There was a tempting, simple answer. Alert the council, put her in safekeeping, hand her over to professionals. He knew, too, what those professionals might do: study her, contain her, perhaps send for specimens. The thought made him cold. Instead, he did something small and brave. He stood and fetched a faded coat from a hook near the door. It smelled of old rain and engine oil. He wrapped it around Lyra's shoulders like a blanket. She smiled, a shy, surprised curve, and the translator gave it as a soft sound. Warm. They ate simple food together: dried bread, preserved fruit, a thin broth Ethan made in a small pot. Lyra ate slowly, fascinated by the textures. She learned to use a spoon in minutes and marveled at the way a single spoonful could be hot and cool, sweet and bitter. Ethan told her stories from the colony, of the markets, of small festivals, of a woman who grew flowers in broken teacups. Lyra listened with wide eyes. She made little sounds that the translator tried to keep up with, and sometimes she answered with a phrase in her own tongue that the device could not map, but Ethan began to understand as comfort. Outside, a soft cluster of lights passed high on the horizon. Ethan looked up and felt a thin streak of fear. He rose and moved to the window. The lights were distant, moving on a predictable path. They would not find them by chance, but if a hunter scouted the area with better instruments, it might be trouble. He closed the curtain gently and returned to Lyra. "We'll make a plan," he said, more to himself than to her. He had no map, no safe route, nothing but a handful of tools and a stubborn belief that people could help one another. He also had something else: the patient ability to improvise that had kept his colony alive through storms and shortfalls. He smiled at Lyra and told himself he would use that ability now. Lyra's eyes found his again, and in them Ethan saw a raw trust, like a child handing over a small treasure. She curled up on the crate with the coat as a pillow and closed her eyes. The translator faded into quiet as the coil cooled. Ethan sat in the dim light and watched her sleep, thinking of all the small things that had to come together to make safe passage. He thought of the colony outside and its rules, of hungry markets and helpful hands. He thought of the hunters and their black nets and what drives a being to chase another across worlds. Ethan did not have answers. He had, at that moment, a clear choice. He could wake the council and follow the law. He could call for help and let the colony decide Lyra's fate. Or he could be what he had always been in small moments of crisis: the person who reached out when another needed it. He folded the coat again and draped it over Lyra as if making a small nest. He promised himself he would not shame his own heart by doing only what was safe. He would do what was right. He did not know yet what that would cost. He only knew that the night had made one truth bright and simple: a being in need was a being in need, and some lines of mercy needed no council to cross. Outside, the wind moved the grasses like slow applause. Inside, two lives sat close and began, in the silence between words, to build the delicate first threads of trust. The machines in the colony hummed their distant song, and Ethan, who had spent his life cataloging the world, understood something new: that sometimes a whole life could change with the choice to bring one small stranger in from the dark. Ethan woke to the soft hum of the morning. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was turning a muted silver blue. Lyra was still asleep on the crate, her small form curled under the worn coat. Her breathing was steady now, less panicked than the night before. He looked at her carefully, noting the way her skin caught the first pale light, glowing faintly like morning dew on glass. He wondered if she slept like humans or if her species had dreams the way they did. He pulled the blankets closer around her shoulders and stepped outside to breathe in the early air. The colony was quiet, a few faint lights flickering on in the distant blocks. The wind carried the same strange scent from the scrublands, a mix of minerals and sharp, wet green that Ethan still could not name. He rubbed his forehead and thought, they could not stay here for long. Lyra was too visible, too extraordinary. Any extended presence in the colony would bring trouble, and he was not certain he could prevent it. When he returned, Lyra was awake. She was sitting on the crate, legs folded neatly beneath her, eyes on the small device that now lay between them. It hummed softly, translating the sound she made into simple words. This morning she spoke slowly, almost like she was testing herself. "Hunters coming," the device said. Ethan nodded. "I know. That's why we have to move." He walked to the table and pulled out the map he had spread the night before. He traced a line with his finger toward the distant ravine, a place he had explored as a child. "There's a place I know. The wind moves strange there, the rocks hide shadows. We might be able to stay there until we find the next step." Lyra tilted her head, making the soft bell sound that translated as safe. He smiled faintly. "Safe as we can be for now. We need to be smart, careful. Not fast, just smart." She nodded, small hands moving in the air to form gestures. She had started mimicking some of Ethan's human movements, copying how he arranged tools, how he pointed to the map, how he spoke with pauses. The translator picked up the rhythm of her attempts and added a line, "Learn from you." Ethan felt a strange warmth. It was a trust he had not earned yet and perhaps never could, but it was there. They packed lightly. Ethan filled a small satchel with food, water, and spare tools. Lyra watched, fascinated by each piece of equipment. "What is this?" she asked at a coil of rope. "Hold fall," Ethan said. She repeated the words carefully, then mimicked the action, tying knots with surprising dexterity. Her small hands worked quickly, precise, like someone who had studied survival in another world. Ethan realized then that her people must have trained her well. She was more than just a frightened child. She was clever, observant, and quick. They stepped outside, moving under the soft light of the rising sun. The terrain was open at first, pale dust and scrub that crunched beneath their boots. Ethan led them toward a ridge that gave a partial view of the ravine. The path was uneven, stones shifting underfoot, but Lyra adapted easily, her small frame balancing with almost supernatural grace. Ethan admired her silently. The humans in the colony were strong, but they were clumsy compared to her. Yet, despite her skill, there was vulnerability in her movements, a constant tension in the set of her shoulders that reminded Ethan why he had to protect her. By mid-morning, they had reached a line of rocks and low shrubs that hid them from view. Ethan crouched and looked back toward the colony. There were no signs of the hunters yet, but he knew they were out there. He had lived long enough to understand how patience could work in their favor. "We rest here for a while," he said. "No noise, no attention. Then we move again." Lyra crouched beside him, eyes scanning the distance. She lifted a hand and traced patterns in the air, faint glimmers appearing around her fingers as the translator hummed, and converted the motion into symbols. "Sense danger?" Ethan asked, understanding that her abilities were more than simple survival skills. She nodded, small energy pulses dancing along her skin like sparks. "Yes," the device translated. "Hunters far not near yet, we can move." They rested, sharing small bites of food. Ethan watched her eat, noting how carefully she chewed, how her tongue darted to taste new flavors. She seemed fascinated by each sensation, the crunch of dried fruit, the wet warmth of water, the dry, soft crumble of bread. For a moment, she was not a hunted creature. She was simply learning, simply living. Ethan realized that was what made this planet different from the others he had visited. Here, curiosity could survive even in fear. By late morning, they began moving again, making their way to the ravine. The path became steeper, rocks jutting out at odd angles. Ethan helped Lyra climb where necessary, but she was surprisingly self-sufficient. At one point, she reached up and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward a stable foothold as if she had suddenly decided he needed support. Ethan laughed softly, the sound echoing in the small canyon between rocks. "I don't need help," he said, "but thank you." She tilted her head, a faint smile breaking across her face. The translator added, "Care for human good." The ravine spread out before them, a deep groove in the land, its walls lined with sharp rocks and hidden caves. The wind moved through it in strange currents, making small whistling sounds that echoed across the dry ground. Ethan led them down a narrow path into a small alcove. It was hidden, sheltered, and the wind did not reach it fully. He knew this place well. As a boy, he had played here, imagining adventures among hidden tunnels and secret caves. Now it was real adventure, and the stakes were higher. They rested again, and Ethan took the time to examine the small device he had made. Lyra watched over his shoulder, curious. She traced her fingers along the glowing coils, and the translator interpreted her thoughts. "Understand how you protect." Ethan nodded. "Yes. Protection can be quiet, careful, not always fight." She made the bell sound of agreement, her small hand brushing his in acknowledgement. As the day wore on, Lyra began to share more about herself. The translator was slow but effective. "Sky City, built high we flew on currents, learning energy family taught me." Ethan listened, fascinated. He imagined buildings suspended above clouds, people moving on currents of wind and light. He asked her if she had friends, and she paused before replying. "Gone only me hunters came." The words weighed on him. He had known loss in many forms, but the finality in her voice made him ache. Yet there was resilience too. She had survived, and she had found him. Evening came, painting the ravine in deep reds and purples. Ethan built a small fire in a safe corner, careful to shield the smoke from the open sky. Lyra sat beside it, eyes wide as the flames danced, her small hands hovering above to feel the warmth. "Fire human good," the translator said. Ethan smiled. "Yes. Warmth can be more than comfort. It can be safety too." She nodded slowly, tracing patterns in the sand with her fingers. The lines glowed faintly for a moment, revealing her quiet energy manipulation. Ethan marveled at the subtle power she wielded without effort. Night fell fully. Ethan and Lyra sat together in the alcove, the stars above bright and strange. Ethan thought about the hunters, imagining their technology and persistence. But he also thought about humans, their ingenuity, their ability to adapt, their courage when faced with something impossible. He realized that Lyra's survival was partly luck, partly skill, but also partly human determination. He had chosen to help her. That simple act might make all the difference. Lyra leaned against him, exhausted but calm. The translator interpreted her final words of the day, "Thank friend human help." Ethan felt the weight of that trust. He could not guarantee the days ahead would be easy, but he could promise to guide her, to protect her as best as he could. For now, that was enough. They would face the hunters together, not with weapons but with patience, wit, and the quiet courage that humans often carried in ordinary moments. In the darkness, the wind moved through the ravine like a whispering chorus. Ethan listened, imagining currents of sound and energy dancing unseen around them. He realized that the world was larger than he had ever known, filled with life both strange and familiar. And at the center of it, a small alien girl trusted a human to help her navigate the dangers she had faced. They slept under a blanket of stars, the fire reduced to embers, each drawing strength from the presence of the other. Ethan felt a strange satisfaction. They had survived the first day, learned from one another, and found safety in a place that seemed ordinary but held countless secrets. He thought about tomorrow, more movement, more careful steps, more challenges. But he also thought about the quiet moments, a shared meal, a glowing coil, a soft bell sound of understanding. These small things were worth more than fear. They were the proof that humans and aliens together could find hope even in the darkest places. Lyra's hand found his in the night, and Ethan did not pull away. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of her energy, gentle and alive. The translator offered no words this time. There was no need. In the silence, trust was already spoken. And somewhere in the wind-blown ravine, the first real chapter of their journey began. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ravine. Ethan stretched, careful not to disturb Lyra, who was still curled under the blanket. Last night had been quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence made him uneasy. He had learned over years of living on this planet that danger rarely came announcing itself politely. He shook the thought from his mind and stood, scanning the horizon. The valley beyond the ravine was wide, but something in the wind felt off, as if currents carried more than just dust. Lyra stirred and sat up, blinking against the sunlight. She had grown comfortable in this small hiding place, but her eyes remained alert, scanning every movement. She lifted a hand slowly, creating a faint glow around her fingertips. The translator picked up her thought. Hunters near watching. Ethan's stomach tightened. "They're closer than we thought," he said quietly. He packed their supplies and glanced at Lyra. "We need a plan." Lyra nodded, small sparks flickering along her skin as she traced patterns in the air. The translator interpreted, "Think together smart." Ethan smiled. That was the approach he trusted most. Human ingenuity paired with Lyra's extraordinary abilities could be the key to surviving. They moved carefully, following a narrow ledge along the side of the ravine. Ethan's mind raced through possible strategies. The hunters were skilled, probably equipped with sensors and tracking devices, but humans were clever. He remembered how the early settlers had survived storms, attacks, and resource shortages through clever use of terrain and knowledge of the land. That was their advantage. Lyra's presence was a constant reminder of that. Her ability to sense energy fields, her subtle manipulation of objects without touching them, and her intuition made her both a guide and a partner. "If we stay high and move quietly, they'll miss us," Ethan whispered. She nodded, her glowing fingers leaving faint trails in the air as she tested the path ahead. As they rounded a bend, Ethan noticed something unusual. Tiny markings in the dust, repeated patterns of footprints that did not match any animal or human he knew. He crouched and traced the path with his finger. "Hunters," he said. Lyra's eyes widened and she touched his arm. The translator interpreted, "Yes, clever, follow us." Ethan understood immediately. The hunters were trying to track them, leaving subtle signs to mislead. He had encountered similar tactics in the past, and he knew how to counter them. "We can trick them," he said, "but we have to split the trail." He picked up a small pouch of dust from the ground and spread it over their path, making the footprints less clear. Lyra watched and imitated, creating faint energy disturbances in the air that confused sensors. The translator picked up her thought. "Hide, shift, safe." They continued, moving slowly but steadily toward a cluster of rock formations that Ethan had used as a lookout in his youth. The rocks were jagged and tall, providing cover and vantage points. He signaled Lyra to climb first. She moved with grace, easily navigating the uneven surface. When she reached the top, she glanced down and sent a small pulse of energy through the ledge, making a faint shimmer that looked like movement in the shadows. The translator interpreted, "Decoy trick them." Ethan followed, careful to stay hidden. From their vantage point, they could see the valley below. Small figures moved, cautious but methodical. The hunters were scanning the area, using devices Ethan had seen in old schematics. Sensors that could detect heat, movement, and energy. But they had not expected the combination of human creativity and Lyra's alien abilities. "Look," Ethan whispered. He pointed to a narrow pass leading deeper into the canyon. "We can lead them there. It's tight, rocky, they can't move quickly." "We use the terrain, not force." Lyra's eyes lit up. She traced a plan in the air, lines connecting rocks, paths, and currents of wind. The translator interpreted, "Use, nature, trap." They spent the next hour preparing. Ethan gathered loose stones and set them in precarious positions along the paths the hunters would likely follow. Lyra created small pulses of energy, subtle enough to confuse sensors but not to alarm the hunters. They tested each step, moving through the area as silently as possible. When they were ready, Ethan looked at Lyra. "We can do this," he said. "We don't need to fight them, just outsmart them. Use their expectations against them." Lyra nodded, small sparks dancing along her skin in agreement. The hunters appeared shortly after, their movements careful, their devices scanning. Ethan and Lyra watched from above. The hunters followed the false trails, misled by dust and subtle energy pulses. Each step they took brought them closer to the narrow pass, exactly where Ethan wanted them. Lyra concentrated, sending small pulses along the ledge to mislead sensors further. The hunters slowed, confused, adjusting their instruments. Ethan's heart raced. The plan was working. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the careful balance of risk and reward. As the hunters entered the narrow pass, Ethan and Lyra acted. They triggered the small stones they had arranged earlier, causing a gentle but effective cascade that blocked part of the path. The hunters paused, looking for a way through. Lyra sent a controlled pulse, just enough to make a shadow flicker across the rocks, suggesting movement where there was none. The hunters adjusted, walking right into the path Ethan had prepared, a winding, narrow route that forced them to slow and maneuver carefully. Ethan whispered, "Patience, let them move." They watched as the hunters navigated the tricky terrain, unaware of the subtle traps ahead. Lyra's small energy pulses continued to confuse their sensors, creating phantom heat signatures and false readings. The hunters muttered among themselves, clearly frustrated. "This way," Ethan said softly, pointing to an upper ledge that offered an escape route for them. Lyra moved first, floating slightly above the ground as she had learned to do, and guided Ethan along the safest path. They climbed steadily, careful not to make noise. Below, the hunters continued to stumble through the engineered pass, unaware they were walking into harmless but frustrating traps. By midday, Ethan and Lyra reached a hidden alcove far above the main valley floor. From there, they could see the hunters struggling below, checking instruments and scratching their heads in confusion. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "See, we don't need weapons. Just brains and careful planning." Lyra nodded, her face bright with a mixture of relief and excitement. The translator captured the sound. "Smart, human, clever." They rested briefly, eating small rations and drinking water. Ethan admired the way Lyra had learned quickly, adapting her abilities to the environment and their strategy. He thought of all the humans who had survived impossible odds through clever use of resources and terrain. It was an instinct embedded in them, something Lyra now understood and respected. Lyra studied the hunters from their high perch. "Hunters, leave soon?" she asked. The translator worked, slowly interpreting her thoughts. Ethan considered the valley below. The hunters were persistent, but their frustration was clear. "They might stay a while," he said, "but they can't follow us here easily. This place is too tricky for them." Lyra nodded, satisfied. They spent the afternoon observing, taking mental notes of the hunters' behavior. Ethan taught Lyra how to read subtle signs, shifts in shadow, faint sounds in the wind, patterns in movement. She absorbed every detail, her curiosity and intelligence shining through. Ethan realized that teaching her these small tricks was just as important as keeping her safe. She needed to be able to protect herself, and she was eager to learn. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Ethan and Lyra prepared to move again. They would not stay in one place for long. Hunters were relentless. But now they had confidence. They had used their wits to outsmart superior technology, and they knew they could do it again. The climb down from the alcove was slow and careful. Lyra floated slightly above the ground, testing each step. Ethan followed, using his experience to choose the safest route. They moved quietly, shadows in the fading light. Below, the hunters continued to struggle, unaware that their quarry had already escaped. Night fell fully as they reached a lower ledge, where they could rest briefly before moving again. Ethan built a small, discreet fire, just enough to provide warmth without attracting attention. Lyra sat beside him, her small hands glowing faintly as she traced patterns in the air. The translator interpreted, "Protect humans safe." Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of trust and responsibility. "You're learning fast," he said softly. Lyra looked at him and made a small bell sound, interpreted as "together strong." Ethan felt a swell of pride. They had survived a day filled with danger, uncertainty, and clever adversaries. They had done it without violence, relying instead on strategy, intelligence, and cooperation. As they settled for the night, Ethan thought about the days ahead. The hunters would not give up easily. They would adapt, seek new ways to track Lyra, and continue their pursuit. But he also knew something important. Humans had survived countless challenges because of ingenuity, empathy, and courage. Lyra had seen that firsthand now. He looked at her as she closed her eyes, faint energy sparks fading with the day's exhaustion. She had learned the first lessons of survival in a new world, guided by a human who cared enough to think beyond rules and protocol. He felt a deep sense of purpose. Protecting her was no longer just about doing the right thing. It was about showing what humans could do when they faced impossible odds. Think, adapt, and persevere. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, carrying whispers of the hunters' frustration. Inside, Ethan and Lyra rested, drawing strength from one another. The night was quiet but full of potential. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more clever strategies, and more tests of their partnership. And as Ethan watched the stars, he felt a quiet certainty. Together, they could outthink any danger and continue the journey that had only just begun. The dawn came slowly over the ravine, painting the jagged rocks in shades of gold and silver. Ethan stirred first, stretching carefully so as not to disturb Lyra, who lay beside him under the worn coat. Her small hands traced faint patterns in the dust, leaving glimmers that shimmered in the rising sunlight. Ethan had learned to recognize them as her way of thinking, analyzing the terrain and sensing the energy around them. He watched her for a long moment. She was calm now, more confident than the first day he had met her, but he knew this calm was fragile. The hunters were still out there, persistent and determined. Ethan stood and surveyed the valley. From their high perch, the hunters' camp was visible, small figures moving cautiously in the distance. Their frustration from the previous day was clear. They had not anticipated the clever use of terrain and subtle energy decoys. "We need to move before they adapt," Ethan said softly. Lyra sat up and tilted her head. The translator interpreted her thoughts. "Path hidden, strong," Ethan nodded. "Yes, hidden, safe, and smart." They packed their few supplies and began to descend carefully through a narrow path that led deeper into the canyon. Ethan led, pointing out weak rocks, loose dirt, and hidden ledges. Lyra floated slightly above the ground, using her small energy pulses to sense shifts in the earth and subtle vibrations in the wind. She was learning quickly, and Ethan felt a mixture of pride and relief. The hunters were close enough that Ethan could hear their distant calls, soft murmurs carried by the canyon winds. Their voices were cautious, and their movements deliberate. It was clear they were searching, but they did not yet know the path Ethan and Lyra had chosen. That gave them an advantage, but it would not last forever. As they moved, Ethan whispered instructions to Lyra. showing her how to use small stones and pebbles to create distractions, how to shift dust patterns to mislead sensors, and how to blend her energy pulses into natural currents so they would go unnoticed. Lyra absorbed each lesson, her small hands glowing faintly with controlled energy. The translator picked up her thoughts. Learn quick, help human. Ethan smiled. That was the kind of partnership he had hoped for, one where human skill and alien ability complemented each other perfectly. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge that led to a hidden alcove Ethan had remembered from his childhood. It was a place where the canyon walls curved inward, creating a natural shelter that the hunters could not see from the main path. Ethan led Lyra inside, careful to check for loose rocks and weak ground. Once inside, he crouched and examined the area. It was perfect, concealed, sturdy, and with a small stream for water nearby. Lyra moved to the edge of the alcove and sent a small pulse of energy down the gorge. The translator interpreted, "Check safe, no watchers." Ethan nodded. "Good. We can rest here for a bit, but we still need a plan for the next step." They ate a simple meal of dried bread and fruit, sitting close together. Lyra watched Ethan carefully as he worked, noting every movement, every decision. Her small hands traced lines in the dust as she spoke softly, the translator interpreting. "Learn human, think." Ethan realized that teaching her was more than survival. It was showing her what humans could do with patience, creativity, and careful observation. After resting, Ethan examined the gorge and the surrounding terrain. The hunters were below, trying to navigate the paths they had followed yesterday. They were frustrated, adjusting instruments and scanning for false signals, but their progress was slow. Ethan knew they would soon realize the alcove was empty. They needed a plan to ensure they could move again without being detected. "I have an idea," Ethan said, tracing lines on the dust floor of the alcove. "We create a false trail, one that leads them away from us. We use rocks, shadows, and your energy pulses to make it convincing. Then we move while they are distracted." Lyra nodded, small sparks dancing along her skin as she traced the plan in the air. The translator interpreted, "Trick hunters human clever." They worked together for hours, setting up small decoys and energy signals that mimicked movement, heat, and even sound. Ethan rolled pebbles down narrow paths, creating the illusion of footsteps, while Lyra sent faint pulses along the rocks, confusing sensors and creating phantom signatures. The canyon seemed alive with tiny signals, all designed to mislead the hunters. As the sun began to lower, Ethan and Lyra prepared to move. They had chosen a route that led to a hidden plateau beyond the gorge, a place where the hunters could not follow easily. The climb would be difficult, but the terrain favored their abilities. Lyra's energy pulses could help detect unstable rocks, and Ethan's experience guided their careful steps. The descent into the hidden path was slow. Ethan led, testing each foothold, while Lyra hovered slightly above the ground, scanning for shifts in the earth and subtle vibrations. The translator interpreted her thoughts constantly. "Safe, adjust, watch human." Ethan felt reassured. She had learned to protect herself and him in small ways, adding a new layer of security. Below them, the hunters had followed the decoy trails and were now far behind, misled by the clever combination of human strategy and Lyra's abilities. Ethan glanced back and felt a surge of pride. They were not safe yet, but they were gaining the upper hand. As they reached the plateau, the view opened up to the surrounding canyon. Ethan scanned the area carefully. It was isolated, with natural barriers on all sides and hidden crevices that could provide shelter if needed. Lyra touched the edge of the plateau with her fingers, sending faint pulses along the rocks. The translator interpreted, "Good, strong hide." They rested for a moment, catching their breath. Lyra's energy pulses glowed faintly in the dimming light, illuminating patterns on the rock's surface. Ethan realized that her abilities were not just for survival. They could be used creatively, to manipulate the environment and provide protection without causing harm. He felt a growing admiration for her intelligence and adaptability. Evening fell fully, painting the plateau in deep reds and purples. Ethan and Lyra set up a small camp, careful to keep smoke and light minimal. They shared a quiet meal, talking softly through the translator. Lyra asked about humans, their lives, and the colony she had seen briefly. Ethan shared stories of survival, clever solutions, and small acts of kindness that had kept people alive and connected. Lyra listened, fascinated, asking questions and absorbing every detail. Suddenly, a faint movement caught Ethan's eye. Shadows shifted in the canyon below. He froze, sensing the hunters might have discovered the decoy. Lyra's small hand touched his arm and the translator interpreted, "Observe, no panic." Ethan nodded. They watched quietly, assessing the situation. The hunters were moving carefully, but the false trails had delayed them significantly. They were cautious, checking every path and scanning for signs of Lyra's energy, but they were not close enough to reach the plateau. "We wait," Ethan whispered. "Patience is our ally." Lyra's glowing fingers traced patterns in the air, reinforcing the signals to further mislead the hunters below. The translator interpreted, "Confused delay, human clever." Hours passed, and the hunters' movements became slower and more uncertain. Their frustration grew, evident even from a distance. Ethan and Lyra remained hidden, observing every shift and vibration in the canyon. They had learned to trust each other completely, their partnership built on mutual respect, careful planning, and a shared understanding of the stakes. As night fully settled, the hunters eventually moved away, still searching but now uncertain and cautious. Ethan exhaled quietly, relieved. They had outsmarted them without confrontation, relying on strategy, intelligence, and Lyra's unique abilities. It was a triumph of cleverness and patience over brute force. Lyra turned to him, her large eyes reflecting the starlight. The translator captured her soft words, "Together, safe, thank human." Ethan felt warmth rise in his chest. He had not only protected her, he had shown her the strength of human ingenuity, the quiet power of thought and careful action. They spent the night on the plateau, watching stars and listening to the gentle currents of wind that moved through the rocks. Ethan taught Lyra how to observe the environment for subtle signs of danger, how to read wind and shadows, and how to use her energy to detect vibrations in the earth. She learned quickly, her curiosity and intelligence evident in every careful movement. Morning arrived, and they began planning the next phase of their journey. Ethan studied the terrain, mapping a safe route to a distant valley where the hunters would have difficulty following. Lyra contributed by scanning for energy currents and potential hazards, her small hands glowing faintly as she traced patterns in the air. The translator interpreted her thoughts, "Path, safe, strong." Together, they moved carefully through the canyon, combining human strategy and alien abilities. The hunters were distant, misled by decoys and false trails, their frustration growing with each step they took in the wrong direction. Ethan felt a quiet pride. They had survived, adapted, and used their wits to ensure safety without causing harm. By midday, they reached the valley, a wide, hidden area filled with natural cover and running water. It was perfect for rest and planning their next move. Lyra's energy pulses blended with the environment, making them nearly invisible to any sensors. Ethan smiled, feeling the relief and satisfaction of a plan well executed. They rested, sharing a meal and talking quietly. Lyra asked about the stars and distant planets, and Ethan shared what he knew, pointing out constellations and explaining how humans navigated space. She listened with wonder, her trust in him deepening with every story and lesson. As evening approached, Ethan realized something important. The hunters were persistent, but humans had a unique strength, the ability to think, adapt, and solve problems creatively. Lyra had learned that strength firsthand, and together, They had proven it could overcome even technologically superior pursuers. They settled for the night, the stars above bright and distant. Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. They had survived the chase, outsmarted the hunters, and forged a partnership that combined human ingenuity with alien ability. Lyra was safe, and together they would continue the journey, exploring a universe that was vast, mysterious, and full of possibility. In the quiet of the hidden valley, Ethan watched Lyra sleep, faint sparks still glowing along her skin. The translator had no words for this moment, none were needed. Trust, courage, and cleverness spoke for themselves. They had faced danger, adapted, and prevailed without harm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they rested in safety, knowing that together they could face whatever came next. Humanity's quiet ingenuity and compassion had protected a life, built trust, and proven that even in the face of superior technology, brains and heart could triumph. The wind moved through the valley, carrying whispers of the distant hunters' confusion. Ethan and Lyra, side by side, drew strength from each other. Their journey was far from over, but they had learned the most important lesson, that courage, cleverness, and partnership could overcome even the greatest challenges. And somewhere in the night, among stars and shadows, hope burned brightly for both human and alien. She was an alien girl on the run, and the human was her only hope.